All right, today we're going to talk about independent Mexico after 1821 when they first gained independence from Spain, and really Mexico's major problems and attempts at solutions for about its first 80 years or so. So that's going to be the first three sections of this lecture. And the fourth section is going to be more generally on Central America, what happened with Central America after it gained independence, and how it went back and forth between a kind of centralized confederation rule over the whole region and then broke apart into different countries that we mostly still know today. All right, so Spain had become involved in some revolutionary wars basically in Europe. Uh, we won't go through the details of all that, but it really allowed Mexico to declare independence in the 18 teens and fought a long independence war attempt against Spain that finally culminated and succeeded in 1821. So this is what Mexico looks like at independence, the general map. It's a very large country. It's much larger than what we today see Mexico as, and we'll get into the reasons for that in a little bit also. But the major player involved in finally ending the independence wars and gaining Mexican independence was actually a Spanish military officer who worked for the Spanish government, who was really an imperial guard and had spent a couple years attacking the independence movement, attacking the Mexican revolutionaries, and in 1821 had really cornered the last of the revolutionaries into one place and seemed poised on the edge of really finally defeating the independence movement and ensuring that Mexico would remain a Spanish colony. But at that moment, some political maneuverings in Spain itself caused a lot of changes within the Spanish government, and this Colonel Iturbide saw an opportunity for himself. That the Spanish government was kind of up in the air and was going through major changes and probably did not have the power to stop an independence movement. So he decided to join the independence movement, and he met with the independence leaders that he had cornered in Mexico and basically struck a deal with them to join their movement and take over their movement as the leader of it, and then negotiate for them with the Spanish government that he had previously just worked for in order to get some kind of treaty to allow for Mexico to gain independence. And this very convoluted plan actually worked. In August 1821, Iturbide got a treaty agreement with the Spanish government representative that became known as the Treaty of Cordoba, which created Mexico as an independent country. So the new Spanish government, their representatives that are sitting in Mexico negotiating this deal, they accept the deal, and the Mexican independence movement rejoices because they believe that they have accomplished their lifelong goal basically. And it looks like this is going to happen until the paperwork, the deal, the signed treaty goes back to Spain. And the Spanish government in Madrid refused it, basically overturned it, and said this is not good, and they want Mexico to revert back to colonial status. So that really threw everything up in the air when the word got back to Mexico that the Spanish government had rejected the treaty. And in their desperation, the Mexican independence leaders, the revolutionaries, the separatists, decided to go a step further in order to try to build some kind of stability. And they proclaimed what they called a Mexican empire. So they didn't just want to be an independent little country. They wanted a powerful country that would dominate a whole lot of Central America. And they wanted a king to be able to rule it so that the king could make emergency decisions very quickly. And so they named Iturbide the first emperor of this Mexican empire, and they officially called him Emperor Augustine I. So he's at the head of this new government, and this is going to be the first government of independent Mexico. The problem, though, is that This new government was impoverished. It didn't have any major revenue source because the revolution had done such economic damage to the area, that the new government was immediately in a fiscal crisis. And a lot of political factions from the different parties and different revolutionary groups built up very quickly. So this Mexican Empire under Augustine I collapsed within about a year in 1822. And at that point, the revolutionaries again got together and they agreed to create a constitution and create a republic instead that would have voting rights and elected leaders instead of this kind of emperor for life. So they create in its place a constitutional Republic of Mexico in 1824 and kicked Iturbide out of the country because he wanted to be emperor. He didn't want to just be another politician that had to run for office in elections. And when he decided to try to come back and return, they arrested him for trying to overthrow the new republic and had him executed. So that's the end of him. So this new constitutional republic will start trying to hold elections as best they can. The problem, though, one problem is that the country is really disunited. It's been largely destroyed by the Revolutionary Wars themselves. So the new Mexican government is going to have all kinds of major problems for its first couple of decades. Its first big problem is that its economy was just annihilated during the Independence Wars. The Independence Wars went on for 10 years and saw what the revolutionaries considered to be invasions of Spanish troops that kind of marauded through towns and did a lot of destruction and killed a lot of people. The colony's major economic output before the war was largely gold and silver being mined out of the ground and sent back to Europe. And a lot of those mines had been destroyed because both the Spanish government and the revolutionaries fought over those mines. They wanted to control those mines for themselves to fund their own goals. So at the end of the war in the 1820s, the gold and silver mines were only producing about 1/3 as much gold and silver as they had before the Revolutionary War had even started. So what little industry existed in Mexico in the 1820s was largely destroyed or attacked in the Revolutionary War. A lot of the trained workers had gone off to war. They had joined armies on one side or the other. A lot of them had been killed or maimed. So the kind of professional or trained workforce had also been destroyed in the war itself. The whole new country only had 3 highways, 3 paved highways, and they weren't even very well paved. And a lot of them had also been attacked and damaged during the war. And there were hardly any major road networks that would even access the highways. So most of Mexico either had dirt roads or not really very good even dirt roads at all. So the attempt at kind of national unification seemed really problematic in its first few years. And since so many of the mines and what industry had existed before the war had been attacked or claimed or destroyed during the war, there was a massive amount of unemployment in Mexico after the war because there just weren't factories or mines for people to go work in anymore. They had to be rebuilt. So right at the end of the war, historians estimate that there's at least a 15% unemployment rate in Mexico, possibly up to 30%. So 1/3 of the workforce is possibly out of work for years after the war ended. So that's a giant kind of economic catastrophe for any new government to try to take over and solve. And to make it even more difficult, the Mexican government was always in the first few years very paranoid that any Spaniards that were left in Mexico after the war, who remained in the country, were more loyal to the Spanish government than to the new Mexican government. And the Mexican government worried that these, Spaniards by birth, these people had been born in Spain and just had lived in Mexico for one reason or another, that they would at some point conspire to try to overthrow the new Mexican government and turn the place back into a Spanish colony. So between 1827 and 1835, so starting about 3 years after this constitutional republic gets off its ground, gets on its feet, starts passing laws to expel, to kick these native Spanish people out of Mexico and basically, kick them out of the country. The problem, though, is that those Spanish people were largely the ones that owned land, that had some money that might be able to invest to rebuild factories or to build new factories or get the mines going again, or invest in some kind of entrepreneurial business that might be able to hire people and reduce the unemployment rate, get business going again, start trade, and start some kind of economic growth. So right at the outset, the Mexican government expelled a lot of the wealthy class that could have financed some kind of economic recovery. So that did a lot of damage to the kind of long-term economic prospects for this new country. And of course, once you kick out a lot of landowners, that means there's a lot of land suddenly for sale. So you start getting some new landowners that are trying to buy land at auctions or something like that as cheap as they can. And they often become a kind of new landowning class, Mexican landowning class, who often get fairly wealthy off of this because they're buying the land so cheap. And if they can get the land to produce and they hire enough workers, they can make a lot of money because their purchase price was so low, their investment cost was so low. So you often get this kind of new aristocracy, which is a fancy word that historians use for wealthy people, who start kind of enjoying their wealth, and they start living ostentatiously and spending money on lavish parties and clothes and things like that. So you often get like this cultural difference between the new landowning class that are really enjoying this new wealth that they've achieved, and they're looking to spend for their own enjoyment in public very often to show it off, and the kind of old landowning families that see that as kind of like immature and irresponsible and kind of immoral. That if you have wealth, it's like it's your obligation to not throw it in people's faces and kind of show it off and all that, because that tends to piss everybody else off. So there's that kind of you'll see a cultural difference between what historians call the new aristocracy and the old landowning families. Let's see. And another major economic problem that Mexico will have is that Mexico is not really going into the Industrial Revolution. That a lot of the forefront of the European countries are getting involved in by the 1820s, 1830s, Britain, United States, France, the German areas, and even parts of Spain itself. Mexico largely will not do that for quite a while. Mexico will remain largely a kind of feudal system where you have these big landowners, and they employ a lot of kind of peasant farmers that pay them either very low wages or don't pay them in money at all. They just kind of allow them to live on the land and feed their families. So that's very reminiscent of European feudalism in the Middle Ages, a time when Europe went through very low rates of economic growth because there's not a lot to invest in except for buying more land and trying to get more workers. So Mexico will be in that kind of economic stagnation problem for several decades in the 1800s. Another major problem that they run into land-wise is that the Catholic Church owns a huge amount of land, just as it did throughout nearly all of the former Spanish colonies going back hundreds of years. Some historians estimate that the Catholic Church may have owned up to half of all of the privately owned land in Mexico. And that is a huge resource for the church, and just as the church have been doing for hundreds of years, it's not like they build churches and all that land. The church basically owns farms and employs farmers, and the church is basically a giant landowner and uses those lands to produce revenue for the church. And the church has so much revenue usually coming in on a yearly basis that they want to make more money off of that money, just like good investors. And so they give out loans, they do loan sharking, they do all kinds of things. So a lot of the Mexican population, much like the rest of the Latin American population during colonial times, they often believe in the church ideas, and they believe in Mass, and they believe in the religious side, but they're very angry at the church for its economic kind of infrastructure. The church runs its lands like a business, and looks to gobble up land for cheap prices and hire workers for low wages and things like that. So a lot of average farmers out there are very angry at the church for what it's doing economically in the society. And the fourth giant problem is just government instability. President Santa Anna is one extreme version of this problem, and I put all these dates up here on the slide. You don't have to write all these dates. I just put them up there to show you how unstable the Mexican government was for the first few decades. So in general, between 1821 and 1860, so about 40 years of this new government, there were 50 different presidencies in 40 years. So that means, on average, each one lasted less than a year. 35 different military officers led these 50 different presidencies. So just like Santa Anna here in the slide, he's in office for a little while, then he gets overthrown or he gets booted out somehow, then he comes back and he gets booted out and goes back and forth, back and forth. So you have 50 different presidencies in 40 years led by only 35 different military men. And again, Santa Anna is the most extreme of it. In 1833, he had 3 different presidencies just in that 1 year alone. And you can see the whole rest of the list. It's again, he's the most extreme example of it, coming in and out of government. So Santa Anna was president 9 times. And even when he was out of office, he was still such a powerful politician that he tended to control other presidents who were in office. So he is one of the major politicians of the 1830s, 1840s, and early 1850s in Mexico. The military officers, largely generals and colonels and whatnot, that rose up the ranks and got into a position to try to become president or a leader of some kind, that would imply that the military actually runs the government and is actually governing the country through all these years. But it doesn't seem to actually be true. Most historians argue that the military had very little desire to actually govern the place. The military just wanted to control the government and use the presidency to, whichever general, to appoint his friends and supporters into different positions in the government to get government salaries so that they get paid well. So it seems that a lot of these presidents and other leaders were mostly just looking for a salary, looking for a yearly kind of source of income for themselves. And that they largely left the day-to-day governing of the country to the trained lawyers and government bureaucrats and things like that, mostly who lived and worked in the offices, the government offices in Mexico City. So the government is very, very unstable. And foreign countries look to these kinds of problems in Mexico as opportunities for themselves. It's a weak economy. The government doesn't have a lot of revenue. Therefore, it cannot really afford to have a big military. It has an unstable government. And that seems to invite a lot of kind of other powers to try to come into the area and take advantage of Mexico for whatever they want or can get. And the biggest example of that is the United States. In what Mexicans call the War of the North American Invasion, the U.S. saw this happening in the 1830s and took advantage of it by sending Americans into this orangish type of area. If I can get the mouse over there. Here in kind of northeastern Mexico, this area called Texas, this province, that was sparsely populated, and the U.S. government and a lot of American white settlers started moving into that area, so much that they started to dominate the area and eventually started a revolution against Mexico to break this area away and into an independent country called Texas. With the full intent of making Texas part of the United States, making Texas a state of the United States. In the 1840s, that opened an even bigger question in the United States. Well, if we can get control of Texas one way or the other, why not just try to invade Mexico and get a whole much bigger chunk of Mexican land? And that's what the United States did in 1845, 1846. They created conditions to force Mexico to start a war to defend themselves, and the U.S. Army just invaded the place. And that's why the Mexican government and a lot of Mexican people still today call it the War of North American Invasion, because it was an invasion from the United States, basically. And the U.S. took full advantage of this opportunity and eventually took a giant chunk of northern Mexico all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, largely along this kind of light greenish border, all the way out to the coastline. And basically conquered the place, and in treaty demanded that the Mexican government, hand it over. And the United States gave Mexico about $15 million for this land, which is an amazingly small amount of money for this huge amount of territory. Nearly doubled the size of the United States virtually overnight. So that was one example of Mexico's comparative weakness to its neighbors, and countries tend to do that throughout human history. When one country sees its neighbor or neighboring civilization as weak, they go in and take what they want. And that loss was so humiliating for the Mexican leaders that it immediately started a kind of revolution in Mexican politics to try to do something to end the instability and to strengthen Mexico enough to be able to defend itself in some type of crisis like this. So Mexico is now 30 years into its independence. Santa Anna is kicked out of the country basically in 1855, and this is where the big reforms can finally start to take place. So two major political parties really rise in what becomes known as the Reform era, starting in 1855. So there's a very conservative party in Mexico whose politicians believe that Mexico losing all that land was really a result of trying to imitate and adopt European norms, values, and institutions, and that instead of doing that, because that had obviously to them led to catastrophe, they should instead return to more Hispanic traditions, build up Mexican traditions, form a closer alliance with the church, and try to build up some kind of centralized power to run the country. Another political party became known as the Liberals, who wanted more European-type modernization, especially economic, like industrialization, modernize the army, and do anything possible to get economic development, economic growth going, because they said that if you get that growth, you'll get revenue, and the government can buy things to defend itself in the future. So the reform movement really gets going in 1855 in a big way. It's largely the liberal side that will kind of push these reforms through. The big ones will largely be ending the fueros, which were the older laws who said that if you're in the Mexican military or the church and you break a normal public law, that you would not go to the normal kind of public legal system. You wouldn't go through the normal court system, the normal law enforcement system. Instead, you would be tried either in a military trial if you were a soldier, or you would be tried through the church's system of enforcing law and rules. So the liberals got rid of that in the reform to make all people living in Mexico basically live under Mexican law and the Mexican court system. It also forced the church, another law, forced the church to start selling off a lot of its kind of excess land that it wasn't being kind of directly used on a daily basis with farmers going out and farming the land, and would eventually kind of force native groups who lived communally and had laid claim to large tracts of land also to also sell it if it appeared that they weren't actually using the land. So again, suddenly you have this era of the government kind of breaking down large landowning groups from the church and natives and forcing a lot of that extra land to be sold at auction. So suddenly there's a lot of land for sale, and anyone who could afford to go to an auction with a little bit of cash might be able to buy a pretty good chunk of land. And of course, the rich people are the ones who have most of the cash, and so they go to the auctions, and it largely turned into a kind of land redistribution from the church and the natives over to the big landowning families who already had land already because they had the money to buy with. They also created a new constitution for Mexico in 1857 that started to lay out a lot of what in the United States we have been known to call unalienable rights, which means your right to property and your right to freedom of speech and all those kinds of things that cannot be taken away from you. That's what unalienable means. It cannot be alienated from you. You have these like kind of natural human rights just as a result of being a living human person. So the liberals were largely pushing a lot of these laws for the first couple years of the reform, and the conservatives were very angry at a bunch of these laws quite often. And that led to what historians have called the War of the Reform, which is basically a type of civil war between the conservative and the liberal faction to see if these laws are going to stand, because if the conservatives take over, they're probably going to undo a bunch of the laws and then go from there. So the major kind of leader, national leader who rises out of this crisis is Benito Juarez. And he's a liberal leader who is elected president in 1861, and he kind of led the liberal forces to victory in 1861. So once they kind of defeated the conservative faction in the war, then the Mexican government immediately faces a kind of bankruptcy problem. So they start basically saying that the government cannot afford to repay a bunch of foreign loans with interest. So Juarez announced a 2-year kind of pause on repaying foreign debts. And that mostly angered European bankers, who were the ones who had lent the money in the first place. And a foreign leader from France, the Emperor of France, named Napoleon III, saw that as an opportunity to get a bunch of European powers behind him to send a French army into Mexico under the statement that, we're going to show this Mexican government what, and we're going to force them to start those payments again. But his real design seemed to be to conquer Mexico and turn it into a French colony. And from there, he wants to build up like this French empire in the Americas or something. So Napoleon III thinks on very kind of large terms of worldwide power. He's one of those kind of megalomaniac types of personalities. And he thinks that this is his great opportunity to kind of launch off on this project to empower France. So he sent a French army in to Mexico to try to do this. And there is a series of battles once the French arrive from 1861. And these battles will go on through 1867. The biggest one is when the French army tried to directly attack Mexico City in 1862 in the spring. So the biggest battle happens at the place called Pueblo, just outside of Mexico City. And this becomes the most famous battle where the Mexican army stood to defend their capital city and really their independence from a foreign colonizer. And this is the biggest, most famous battle on May 5th, 1862, because this is where it's pretty much recognized that the French are not going to be able to conquer Mexico. So this is where the Cinco de Mayo celebrations come from, where Mexico celebrates its ability to defend its independence from foreign conquest. And they have these celebrations every year, obviously. But Napoleon III does not really want to give up on trying to intimidate the Mexican government or eventually take over or something. So Napoleon was able to somehow remove Benito Juarez from office, to get him kicked out basically, and try to replace him with a European emperor. Basically Napoleon III did this by making a deal with the Mexican conservatives who hated Juarez and wanted him out. So the Mexican conservatives make a deal with Napoleon to bring in this foreign emperor for Mexico. And the guy shows up in 1864 and starts releasing people from prison that Juarez had imprisoned and whatnot. And so the conservatives really liked the guy at first. But his problem is that Napoleon III wants to launch other wars in other parts of the world to kind of grow his empire. And so he gets kind of distracted, and he takes his French army out of Mexico and leaves this European emperor named Maximilian pretty much just hanging. Most Mexicans hated the guy, and without the French army there to protect him, he was quickly overthrown. Juarez came back, retook power in May 1867, and had this European emperor executed. So Juarez is in office, and they hold another presidential election in 1867, which he wins, so he is the sitting president of Mexico. And he's going to start some more reforms in 1867. So he mostly wants to build up an educational system, reform the economy, do some pretty basic things. So he's going to continue doing that for the next 4 years, his presidential term. And Juarez will run for re-election again for a fourth time in 1871. So this would be his third re-election attempt. And he really barely won that election against several other candidates. One of them is named Porfirio Diaz. And Diaz was angry and refused to accept the result of the election. And, complained that, even if Juarez had won the election, this guy being in power for so long tends to corrupt people, and no country should have one president in power for so long because they tend to take over the country's institutions and whatnot, and it just gets really hard to get them out of power, to defeat them in an election. So Diaz started a short kind of uprising against Juarez in 1871, which Juarez put down pretty quickly. Diaz didn't have a whole lot of support for this. Most of the Mexican people supported the kind of official election outcome under the Constitution. So Juarez stays in power through 1872 when he suddenly had a heart attack and died in office. So his vice president kind of ran out the rest of the presidential term through 1876. And then that vice president ran for re-election in 1876, and Diaz comes back and also runs for in that election for president in 1876. And Diaz is kind of giving speeches and building up his support group, and he's basically, you don't have a democracy if these same politicians can go for re-election over and over and over and over and over again, and they keep winning. Something's really wrong with that. So he didn't really trust this electoral process very much. So he gets a militia together and invades and conquers Mexico City basically in November 1876, and basically just took over the government. And kicked the sitting president out, and basically started a new government under himself, which leads us into what historians call the Diaz era in Mexican history, which will go all the way into the early 1900s. So Diaz will himself stay in office for quite a long time, which a lot of historians and even Mexican people at the time really criticized. So historians have felt kind of responsible for trying to figure out how did this guy who complained about other politicians being in power for so many years, how did he stay in power really 35 years? And historians have written quite a lot about that question, so we'll go through some of the kind of major answers and results that historians have kind of identified. The number one that they can agree on pretty generally is that Diaz encouraged kind of fighting and rivalries amongst the regional landowners that were in Mexico called the caudillos. And that term will kind of spread throughout the rest of Latin America. It's a general term that means kind of aristocrat, wealthy landowner who doesn't really work for themselves. They more kind of run a land-based business. They have like a large plantation, sometimes with hundreds of farming employees. And the farmers do the work while the landowner kind of sits in the house and kind of counts his investment, counts his money, goes to parties, and makes political contacts to keep the whole kind of landowning economic system in power. But there's these major landowners all over Mexico. And one problem that we've seen throughout human history is that you can have a central government, but if the landowners get big and wealthy and powerful themselves, and if they eventually get together and form an alliance amongst themselves, they have enough money to hire soldiers to start a civil war and try to overthrow the government. And Diaz was very aware of that. So he did not want them to get together. He didn't want the landowners to agree on much of anything. So he actually encouraged rivalries and infighting amongst them, so that if they're going to fight anybody, he wants them to fight each other and harm each other's power, so that none of them are powerful enough to come after him. So it's basically a kind of divide and conquer type strategy. Another thing that he did was build up the national army. He invested a lot of government revenue in modernizing the army, hiring a lot of soldiers, paying pretty good salaries to the military officers who ran and trained the army, to keep really the power that all dictators rely on, military power, the army, to keep him in office, to keep him on top, basically, to keep him running the government. So he invested very heavily in the army, modernizing it as best he could, according to some of the best kind of military standards of the time. And the army largely supported him and kept him in power year after year, decade after decade. He didn't just build a national army, he also built up a kind of rural police force, which became known as the Guardias Rurales. And these were basically, they weren't really police as we think of them as general law enforcement, but Diaz built this force and used it mostly to intimidate and scare just average people out in the countryside, average farmers out there. So they were kind of the shock troops that would go out and punish people for small infractions, or threaten anyone who might talk about revolt, or anyone who might start talking about maybe we need new government or new leadership or something like that. He would send the Guardias Rurales out to those areas and deal with those people, sometimes pretty brutally. Another thing that he did was he did not make the mistake that both the liberals and the conservatives had made in the previous era before him. He learned from Mexican history, especially in relation to the church. He thought the liberals had gone too far in attacking the church's power, and that turned the church and the conservatives against him, and a lot of the population against the liberals. But he also knew that a lot of Mexicans were very angry at the church's economic power and its influence, and so he didn't want to fully support the Catholic Church, because that could also anger the population. So Diaz was smart enough to kind of stay in between. He was basically neutral toward the church. He didn't defend it the way the conservatives had, and he didn't attack it the way the liberals had. So he just kind of kept a type of hands-off type of policy. And if the church started kind of claiming more power for themselves, he might try to rein them in. But he sent his wife out, who was very religious, to be a kind of spokesperson or a mediator between the government and the church. So she was largely responsible for kind of running messages and negotiating and meeting with church leaders in public to kind of be a symbolic government personality that was involved with the church, to have that connection for the people to look for if they were interested in that, to believe in. So Diaz he saw the church as kind of a big explosive question in the society that if he mismanaged it could really cause a lot of problems for him. So he avoided it as much as he could. Another big thing that he did was land redistribution. So Diaz actually fell on the liberal side with this. He did want to redistribute land. Mexico had a lot of, especially what he called kind of barren land that wasn't really being used, that he wanted the government to kind of take over and give out to poor peasants to get them some land for themselves, and to give to people to keep him on his side, because he knew that if he gave land to average peasants out there, land was the engine of wealth back then in these kind of rural agricultural based economies. That's how people got rich. That's how you rose in society to wealth. And he knew if he gave land to certain people that they would support him forever. They would love him for it because he's making them rich, and he just builds up a political support base amongst more landowners. And again, he tried to mostly give the unused land, and got a law passed in 1894 about giving unused land to over to private people for their use, so they can build farms or whatever they want to do with it, really. Diaz was also very interested in getting foreign investment, and this is a very popular thing amongst Latin American countries in the 1800s. They often start off like Mexico did, with small economies that were mostly agricultural, and they want to modernize. They want to industrialize, and they try to figure out how to do it. And the general solution that a lot of Latin American leaders came to was to get loans from foreign investors, foreign banks, usually banks in the United States or Canada or Europe, who have some money to lend, to get money into the country, and to use that money to build factories or build cities or public works like roads and running water, plumbing systems, trash collection systems, whatever they're looking to do. This is basically capital investment, bringing money in to modernize the society as much as possible. So he gave a lot of pretty good deals to foreign investors, largely by limiting their tax obligations or something, to bring a foreign company into Mexico so that they'll build a factory or build whatever they need to run their business, and they will hire Mexican workers because those are the workers that are around, and so you'll have more Mexicans working, making paychecks, stabilizing society, paying taxes into government revenue. Diaz becomes a kind of expert in what historians often call political patronage, which means giving government jobs or giving land or some kind of resources to your supporters and friends, to keep them as your supporters as friends and friends, so they don't turn against you and look for someone else to support. It's basically, when you get into office, you hire your friends, give them government salaries, and even sometimes look the other way when they become corrupt and take bribes and whatnot. And that's generally called patronage, and it's been happening throughout human history. So Diaz is an expert in that stuff. He also has the Constitution amended a few times to allow him to keep running for re-election as president, and he remains president through 1911, so that's 35 years in office. So even though he at first ran for office on the complaint of the other generation of politicians like Juarez running for re-election over and over again, once he gets into power himself, he wants to perpetuate his power and stay in office as long as he can. So many historians argue that he went in as a kind of new politician that wants to set things right or something like that, but he was also corrupted by power, and that his argument eventually becomes that he thinks that political stability is the most important thing for Mexico in this time, which many politicians and tyrants and dictators, they use that statement, stability is the most important for a society now, to justify repression and corruption and bribery and staying in office for decades sometimes. So it's a pretty common thing that we have in governments throughout human history, throughout all civilizations, basically, all the way back into ancient times. So Diaz mostly over time kept power by supporting giving them favors, giving them breaks, listening to their demands and their needs, and they continued supporting him in office in exchange. That doesn't mean that Mexico goes through like some extraordinarily bad times. There are some good economic results of all this. There is a giant influx of infrastructure. The Diaz government will build massive amounts of infrastructure. He's hoping mostly that will help the economy grow and modernize the society. One of the biggest examples is just railroad construction. When he was first in office in the late 1870s, Mexico only had about 700 miles of railroad track in the whole country. So he pushed his government, invested heavily in getting railroads built so that goods and supplies and people can move around Mexico more easily. So just by 1884, so 8 years after he's in power, Mexico went from about 700 miles of track to over 3,000 miles. So he basically quadrupled the amount of railroads that were built in his first 8 years, and then kicked it up to 12,000 miles of track by the year 1900. So it's a massive building project. And largely contracted with foreign companies to come in and build railroads, because companies had been building railroads in the United States and Britain and parts of the Germanys and France and whatnot for a couple decades by then. So they were the real experts in doing it. And so he gave the government contracts to foreign companies to build these things. And then he nationalized the railroad system, which means that the government took over all these privately owned railroads in 1907. So basically he paid these railroad companies to build the railroads up till 1900 and let them run it for a few years, and then the government just took over all that property and ran it as a government system. Foreign trade boomed in the Diaz years. So there's some industrialization, especially in textiles, basically clothing and shoes and sails for ships, and anything that's really made out of cloth is kind of textiles. There's a cement business that gets going, a cement industry, an iron industry that gets going in Mexico that becomes very profitable. So the economy is growing, and a lot of the goods that are produced in these factories are sold internationally. So they're put on boats or on railroads or something and shipped out of the country to sell to the rest of the world. But generally, the Mexican economy is still heavily agricultural, is still mostly reliant on kind of ranching and farming in the north. There's still gold and silver mines in the north. There's largely wheat and grain farming in the central areas. Sugar is grown in the southeastern regions where it's a little more kind of tropical-ish, where the region, there's kind of climate is more accessible for sugar. And sugar is a very valuable, highly sold commodity all over the world, so it's a big money maker. Most of the investors in Mexico were largely foreigners. So the big business owners were not Mexican nationals themselves. They were foreigners coming into Mexico to invest and build factories or whatever they're building to build up a business. So for a long time, Mexico does not build up its own kind of capitalist or entrepreneurial or middle class of investors or professionals. So they'll continue having that problem into the 1900s. So most of the Mexican population was fairly poor. Most of them worked in agriculture. They worked on farms, or they worked in these kind of factories that you would probably think of today as more sweatshop type conditions. Only about 25% of the Mexican population was literate, was schooled enough to read and write. And there's a lot of labor complaints because these foreign companies and investors are going into Mexico because they're looking for the lowest wage labor they can possibly find in the world. And a lot of those farmers and sweatshop workers work very long hours for little money, and that tends to anger them over time. And they start trying to form unions. They start trying to go on strike or do some other kind of complaints or attacks on the kind of capitalistic investor class. But again, Diaz stays in power. He's largely pretty much always in Mexico City. That's where the capital city is. That's where the government administration is. And he largely stayed in power by handing out jobs and patronage to people his age and his generation. The problem for that, though, for the long term is, he goes into office in middle age, so he's in office for 35 years. So by the 1900s, he's getting fairly old, and his generation of leaders that he has kept with him are also getting to be fairly old. And the younger generation of politicians or entrepreneurs or people who want to be landowners, they're kind of locked out of the system. They're not his group. So they're kind of political outsiders, and they start getting very angry at that kind of outsider status because they also want access to those government salaries and the landowning opportunities and investment opportunities and all the patronage. So by 1910, you're going to see some of the younger politicians will start complaining about Diaz and saying we have to have like either a better democracy or just kick the guy out in general and clean up the government, clean up a lot of this kind of patronage and bribery. So that'll become a kind of generational shift in Mexican politics as we get into the 1900s. So we'll kind of stop with Mexico at that point and then move into kind of Central America, which is further south from Mexico. This kind of large kind of piece of land that's like this kind of umbilical cord between North America, where Mexico starts, and South America, down by Colombia. So, Central America was also a Spanish colony up until the early 1800s. It was overwhelmingly the population was native. So about 65% were just natives who lived in the area and had generationally lived in Central America for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. Central American population was only about 4% European immigrant. So Spain kind of laid claim to the area, but there's not a whole bunch of Spanish big landowners that are kind of in the area and running the place. They're relatively few. I mean, 4% is a pretty small population. So pretty much the rest, a little over 30% of the Central American population was what we call mixed race. So the Europeans came in, they became landowners, and start having mixed race children with the native population. So about 4 or 5% Europeans in Central America, about 65% native, and the remainder are like the kind of merger of the two, this mixed race kind of children, and then grandchildren and whatnot as the generations go forward. So Central America was not really a very important place to Spain as a colony because it didn't generate a whole lot of revenue. There wasn't a lot of economic growth. It was overwhelmingly agricultural. So there were some conflicts between some Central Americans who wanted to become independent from Spain or wanted more authority in their kind of local regions. They didn't want the Spanish government kind of running their affairs so closely. But largely there's not a whole lot of violence in Central America in this revolutionary era. There is a kind of separatist or liberal party who want to break away from Spain, but they're not starting an outright revolution to do it for the most part. They largely get independence from Spain as a result of Mexico's independence. So when Mexico, with Iturbide, as we first started this lecture off with, when he took advantage of some Spanish government problems in 1820, 1821 to lead Mexico's independence, that kind of filtered down to Central America, where the Central Americans realized, well, if Spain can't even control the bigger, richer colony of Mexico, then maybe we should just declare independence too. We'll probably get away with it because they can't control their more valuable areas, so they're probably not going to try to come back and put us back under the Spanish Empire. So that's largely how it happened. Central America became independent and largely kind of just signed a deal to join the Mexican Empire that started in 1821, 22, 23, 24. So at first, Central America, all these areas were part of Mexico when Mexico became independent. But again, that only lasted 1 year because that Mexican Empire under Iturbide only lasted 1 year before it collapsed under all these kind of political factions and fiscal problems and whatnot. So there was a moment where Central America was part of Mexico, but it just didn't last long. So when the Mexican Empire collapsed, the Central American kind of areas basically declared their independence and broke off from Mexico and created what they called the United Provinces of Central America. So they create basically all these provinces, really from kind of Costa Rica going further north up into today's Guatemala. They all become kind of one confederation, one government, and all these different regions will be like little kind of provinces, kind of like states in the United States. So they join together as a kind of United States of Central America, basically. The one area that stays part of Mexico is Chiapas, which is basically kind of very southern Mexico. So that all happened after Iturbide abdicated and the Mexican Empire fell apart. And again, it was almost totally nonviolent, where the Central American kind of super state comes into being. It's not very wealthy. It has a lot of fiscal problems. Its economy has stagnated, but at least it didn't have a giant revolutionary war like Mexico did that wiped out and destroyed its whole economy. So they'll have a different kinds of economic problems to deal with, mostly just getting their economy off the ground, trying to get some kind of economic growth going in the first place, but not a result of kind of wanton destruction from a civil war, basically. Let's see. All right, so we'll generally see a big split in Central American politics, even under a confederation. So just like Mexico, we're going to see a split between a kind of liberal faction and a more conservative faction. The liberals, much like in Mexico, they wanted to limit the church's power. They wanted to cut taxes. One of the big things that they wanted to end slavery, which is still in existence throughout most of the former Spanish colonies. So that's something we're going to see pop up again and again, that these newly independent Latin American governments will have to deal with and figure out how they're going to deal with through the 1800s. So the liberals wanted to end slavery. They wanted to use government revenue to kind of spur economic development. And the liberals were largely kind of bureaucrats and professionals and middle class type people. Some of the landowners who thought that the government's spending tax revenue to get economic growth going would benefit them as landowners. The conservatives largely wanted stability and order, and they saw the church as a system of stability and order, so they're very kind of pro-church, and they want to have a very powerful church for their society. And mostly the major landowners support the conservative side because the major landowners are the rich people, and rich people always want stability. They want just a nice, consistent growth. They don't want big upheaval because upheaval could threaten their source of wealth. So that's pretty much true throughout human history. People who are rich, who have become wealthy, just want things to stay just as they are because they want to continue staying wealthy, and they're afraid of any major changes because changes could lead to revolutions that might destroy their wealth, or some kind of big legal changes that might alter the tax base or something that could attack their wealth. So we will start to see some small amount of kind of warfare between the political factions in the 1820s, and the liberals tend to win those fights in the 1820s until a conservative leader named Jose Rafael Carrera kind of rises in conservative politics and becomes their kind of factional leader in the 1830s. And he really leads a conservative comeback in the 1830s. And he starts pushing for his view of what conservatism should stand for, and really starts getting this stuff enacted throughout this Central American government. The big one is that he wants Catholicism to be the state religion. So he wants the government to officially proclaim that everyone in the country should be Catholic. So there's not going to be a whole lot of religious freedom here. He wants to build up a court system because he wants to bring charges against people who break laws, and that's part of the stability part, the kind of law and order conservatism part. He wants to stop assimilating with natives. A lot of conservatives and even a lot of liberals back then were fairly racist and thought that people with darker skin or who lived in kind of native communal tribal circumstances were less kind of evolved or less developed and were therefore backward, and that it would only do damage to the kind of Spanish or the white race if you mix with them and have children with them. So he wanted to stop assimilation, kind of separate the races in what in the United States we would call a kind of segregation type system. Carrera, his also giant kind of influence on Central America is by the mid-1830s he will argue that the Confederation, this United Provinces of Central America, just isn't working. There's a lot of political infighting, there's a lot of problems that are not getting solved. So he basically argues by 1838 that we should give up on the Confederation, that Central America should be allowed to split up into a series of different countries that we saw on the map. And that's largely what happens in 1838. The Confederation is ended. And the Confederation Congress basically voted to do that themselves. So it wasn't so much a revolution from below that destroyed the Confederation government. It was the leadership saying that what we have is not functioning. And so they voted to just end it and make all those smaller regions independent countries. Carrera, though, is also a very smart politician, and he has personal alliances and relationships with a lot of the emergent political leaders in each of those different little countries. So to kind of go back to the map real quick, so he has personal relationships with the people who will start to run these countries, like Guatemala. Let's get a mouse so you can see. Guatemala here, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. These are the major independent governments. Belize will rise later. And Carrera has those personal relationships with all of those leaders, and he remains influential over virtually all of them. So he retains a lot of power over the whole region for decades, even though the Confederation has split up in 1838. So he has a lot of political influence over the region until he died in 1865. So one of the big things that, again, foreign countries notice about what they perceive as a relative weakness in Central America is that these leaders can't really get together to defend themselves very much, and so a lot of foreign countries like vultures start looking at Central America as fairly weak, and they're going to start trying to take advantage of Central America as best they can for their own purposes. And the big thing that they wanted largely is a canal through somewhere in Central America to link the Pacific Ocean out here with the Caribbean Sea, to link the Pacific Ocean with the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. Because without a canal, Europeans have been looking for some water-based passage to get through the Americas from one ocean to the other ever since the era of Christopher Columbus, basically. And they had never found it because it didn't exist. So they had tried sailing through Canada, they had tried sailing all the way around South America, and they never found any water-based passage to go from one ocean to the other. The best that they could do is to go around the southern tip of South America, which is very dangerous because that's right where like this very kind of warmish Pacific type of water meets very coldish Antarctic water and tends to cause a lot of storms. So it's a very stormy area to try to sail through and very dangerous for much of the year. So sailing around the southern tip of South America is not a reliable, consistent path for investors and businesses to move goods and profits and people and whatever else back and forth from the Americas to Europe, and especially the Western American coastline to Europe. So Europeans have been interested in some kind of water-based passage through the Americas for years to try to get around having to go around the tip of South America. And in the 1800s, with the Industrial Revolution, there's a lot of optimism that they'll be able to build that thing somewhere because they never found a natural waterway, so they're starting to think of using industrial systems to dig some kind of canal to build a man-made waterway to get from one ocean to the other. And the first area that they really hit on is in Nicaragua. So a lot of industrial engineers in Europe and the United States think that Nicaragua is actually the best place to try to build this canal or series of canals. And they'll start eventually trying to get deals with the Nicaraguan government to do this. And the area that they're going to target is going to be right here on the map. There is a river that runs from this arrow going westward. And I'm take my own arrow maybe. And there's a river that comes in from the ocean and goes far inland and nearly connects to this lake, which is right on the border of Nicaragua and Costa Rica. So a lot of European and American governments will start negotiating with the Costa Rican and Nicaraguan governments, and they'll want to build a canal first in the river, and then they'll have to build another canal to connect it to the lake. And they figure they're going to have to build a third canal on the west side of the lake so that the ships can get over the water of the lake and then go through this third canal far on the west, and that canal will give them access to the Pacific Ocean. So it'll be a series of 3 different canals in these very strategic locations. And some American companies actually get a deal with the Nicaraguan government in 1849 to start building this series of canals. But then the British government intervenes and convinces the Costa Rican government to try to shut this down because the British don't want the Americans to build a canal, because then the Americans will control a canal. So the British want to build it themselves in order to control it. So there's all these levels of international politics and power relations going on that will determine who eventually will try and hopefully succeed to build a canal from at least a U.S. and European perspective. So the Liberal Party that's in control of Nicaragua still wants to build a canal, but they have the British kind of bugging them and trying to stop them from doing it. So the Liberals actually asked the U.S. government for help. And the U.S. government sent this guy named William Walker, who was this kind of fairly young adventurer, down to Nicaragua to try to figure out how to ensure that a canal gets built and that the United States will control. So Walker goes to Nicaragua and strikes a deal with the Liberal Party that controls the Nicaraguan government, basically to attack the Conservative Party and kick them out of office so that the Liberals can easily form a deal. The Liberals agree to do that, and they start attacking the Conservatives. And once that's accomplished, then Walker seems to have attacked the Liberals and kicked them out of government and just taken the government over for himself completely, personally, and named himself basically as the King of Nicaragua. And starts trying to get getting the canal built. So he's going to bring in U.S. soldiers into Nicaragua to defend him. He's going to start making deals with American companies to come into Nicaragua to build this thing. And the worst thing that he does, the probably most short-sighted thing, is that he's a Southerner himself, so he brings Southern Americans into Nicaragua to help kind of back his government and protect him, but they also bring their Southern slaves into Nicaragua, which was hugely offensive to the Nicaraguan people, who've been trying to kind of get rid of slavery for quite a while. And that seems to be kind of the last straw for a lot of the Nicaraguans. So they eventually overthrow him in 1857. They kick him out of the country. And when he tried to come back in 1860, they arrest him and execute him. So that's the end of William Walker. But this shows us how much the American government and other foreign governments like the British want to get this canal built, and what they're willing to do to get it built so they can control it. They're willing to kill lots of people. They're willing to overthrow foreign governments, and they're willing to set up tyrannies over those foreign governments to retain that control. So this is some pretty ugly imperial stuff that sadly we'll see kind of replicated over and over again throughout the rest of Latin American history to today. Generally, though, the liberal parties will start to take over and win elections or otherwise take over Central American governments for the rest of the century, largely starting about the 1850s in El Salvador, and then in Costa Rica in the 1870s, in Guatemala in the 1870s, and Nicaragua by the 1890s. So liberals will start to kind of take over the areas and start pushing for liberal policies in general. And they mostly want to stay in power. So even though they're liberal parties that they might at first win elections or something to get into power, they'll often use fraudulent elections or rigged elections or just flat out start authoritarian governments, tyrannies, dictatorships in order to keep power for themselves. So they will turn to very non-liberal types of strategies in order to stay in power for the long term. Largely the kind of landed classes, the landed elites, the landowners, and the middle classes, the professionals tend to support liberals because the liberals are going to make deals with foreign powers to get infrastructure development, to get loans, to bring foreign companies into a country and start building factories or something like this, building railroads, whatever their big policies are, depending on the country, the individual country you want to focus on. The liberals also generally modernize armies because they're using authoritarian systems to stay in power, and authoritarians rely on military force to repress the population. So they will spend a lot of tax revenue, a lot of government money on modernizing armies and building up their armies in order to protect them, basically. And since the liberals are using an authoritarian system to control the government, that means that a lot of the younger generation who want to be politicians, they can't really run for office and win elections because they're just kind of frozen out of the system. So a lot of the younger people, younger men in Central America who want to go into politics eventually, they go to military school and join the army and try to rise through the ranks of the army, eventually to get up to a high level in the army to the point where they can try to kind of get into some kind of powerful government office or build a political career based on their military history. A lot of liberals in different countries also go after the church's power. They will start to get rid of this idea that Catholicism is like a state-sponsored religion, and liberals in general want to have more religious freedom for their populations. And religious freedom also means freedom to be Catholic. So most of them, they don't kick the Catholic Church completely out of the country. Catholic Church gets to keep a lot of its land and its church properties, and they still get to run their religious system for the people who choose to be part of that system, but they're not forced to by government, and there's the liberals do not run government persecutions of people who aren't going to the Catholic Church on a weekly basis or something like that. All right, the landowners continue to control what historians tend to call a cash crop economy, which is national economies that will largely grow just one or maybe a few major crops. So they largely do not grow food for their own population's sustenance. They don't grow food to feed their population. They grow tons of bananas all over the farms of an individual country in order to sell those bananas on the international market to make money, and then use that money through tax revenue to basically feed the population. So this becomes known as a cash crop system because it's seen as literally growing money out of the ground. So bananas become one of the biggest things in Central America. Coffee starts to get introduced into Central America in the 1830s in Costa Rica and then Guatemala, and starts to gradually grow and grow and grow until it becomes pretty dominant aspect of the Central American economy by the 1870s, 1880s. And Central America still to this day accounts for about 15% of all worldwide coffee production. So it's still a major cash crop for modern Central American countries even today. And of course, a lot of these fairly tyrannical landowner-based governments they make deals with foreign powers, largely to stay in office. They realize that foreigners want something from them, either bananas or a canal or something or other. And much like Diaz in Mexico, these are generally politicians that are running dictatorships of one way or another. They're generally making deals with their own landowners to keep support amongst the wealthy for the government. But they're also afraid if they anger a powerful foreign government like the U.S. or Britain, France, Spain, whoever, that foreign government might send in an army and just conquer the place and turn it into a colony. So a lot of these Central American leaders will also make political deals and economic deals with some of the most powerful, what historians tend to call the great powers of the world. And that's generally what we're going to see as the normal type of Central American government. The governments are dominated by relatively few major landowning families. Usually 10 or 20 different major landowning families in a country will dominate that country's government. El Salvador is probably one of the most famous of that, where they had 14 different landowning families that control the government well into the 1900s. So that's in El Salvador. And a lot of these become known as eventually what in the United States we'll call them banana republics, which they may officially proclaim themselves to be a republic. And like Mexico, they might have elections, but the ruling families are pretty much in charge, and they use bribery and corruption and rigged elections to stay in power. And they're supported by foreign governments and foreign companies that have a vested interest in that government ensuring that the bananas will continue to be grown. So it's really a deal amongst the elites internationally. Elite businesses, powerful governments around the world, and the major landowners of those individual companies or countries. They often just make kind of a three-way deal in order to keep the system in order and keep it perpetuated, so that each of the three players in the system can continue enriching themselves and keeping themselves in power, to the gross detriment usually of the general population of that country. So the general population will largely be farmers, kind of peasant farmers out in the fields growing the bananas or the coffee, doing the daily labor, the work. So they'll often be called the colonos, basically the colonized laborers, who live and work on giant banana or coffee or sugar plantations. And they are barely eking out a survival, whereas the big landowners and the people running the government are getting hugely rich. There's also a large class called the jornaleros, which are basically day laborers who work for wages, and they might have their own small family farm or something like that, but they might be kind of craftsmen. They might travel around the country doing different kinds of work, so they have a little bit more mobility than the peasant farm workers. But it's really not that much more, because again, the landowners and the big companies really dominate the scene. So that's where we're going to stop here for today. So we've gone through Mexico and Central American governments and kind of economics and kind of social aspects right up until the early 1900s. And we'll next go through a couple other major regions of Latin America in the 1800s. And in the next kind of section of the class after the first test, we'll come back to Central America and talk about how they start to develop in the 1900s.